Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. One of the things about this class that's neat is that each time we talk about a new topic, I remember when I first learned about it as an undergrad. And when I was a freshman, I had a class on comparative politics. And it was the first class that I really, really thought a lot about. And going in, I was an English major. But I became a political science major after taking this class. And in fact, the first day of the class, I changed my major. But that class, we learned about, among other things, institutions. And the professor would say that institutions we value for their own sake, and we take them for granted, and we don't think about them because they serve such an important role that it almost becomes a foregone assumption that they just exist. And political parties are one of those institutions. And perhaps more than any other institution in democracy, parties are forgotten. We don't even think about it. We don't even really consider the role or the function of a political party. In fact, many of us, understandably, have grown hostile to parties because we view them as destructive or we view them as bad for democracy in some way or another. This discussion has us considering the role and the function of parties, but also the value of parties and whether we need them or not. And so in this class, we have a unique opportunity to talk about institutions and specifically parties and how parties function to support or potentially work against democracy depending on the circumstances. So this week, we're going to talk about parties, and we're going to address the question of whether parties help or hurt democracy and what role they play and how that works. We're going to start in an interesting and fun way. And we're going to go to Nunavut, which is a province in Canada. And they actually have what they refer to as a consensus government, but they don't refer to consensus in the way that LIPART does. Instead, for them, consensus means no parties, no political parties. They have a system that does not have parties. And I know that for many of you, this may seem very, very attractive, and it may be. So let's pause, step back, and consider their system for a moment before we come back and think about the big picture.
I witnessed as he strode across the floor with anger fierce in his eyes and face.
You won't see this in the Nunavut legislature. So what is consensus government? The main characteristic? There are no political parties. Our consensus-style government is closer to the traditional way Inuit made decisions, with listening, cooperation, and respect. Inuit make up 85% of Nunavut's population. Nunavut is here, in Canada's Arctic. It's the newest territory, with 25 communities spread out over 1/5 of Canada's landmass, none of which are connected by roads to each other or southern Canada. In an election, candidates run as independents. A few weeks later, the new members of the Legislative Assembly meet for a public forum. That's when they elect from among themselves a speaker, a premier, and cabinet ministers. It's all done by secret ballot. Then the premier assigns portfolios to the cabinet ministers. The premier and the cabinet then act like the governing party, with the rest of the MLAs acting as the official opposition. When the legislature sits, bills can only pass with a majority vote. Regular MLAs can vote any way they like, but cabinet is expected to vote together. In this system, there are more regular MLAs than cabinet members. What stands out with a consensus government? It's often more civil than the party system. There's rarely any shouting or heckling. But with no parties, MLAs are more likely to tackle really local issues like paving roads or municipal services, and not broader Nunavut issues like cost of living or mental health. Bringing the party system to Nunavut has been discussed, but the consensus is consensus stays.
You know, where I'm from, Nebraska, they also have a nonpartisan legislature. The way it works is there are just no party labels, and you're elected based on a platform that is really more ideological, but that doesn't have a partisan component. And the reason that these examples are so important is because they're so rare. In fact, parties dominate politics and structure politics virtually everywhere. It's so hard for us to imagine democracy without them that sometimes uh, you think about democracy and democratic politics and you think about the parties themselves first. In the US, those parties are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. But there is this other way where no parties at all exist and the government functions instead without them, and none of in Nebraska being examples. Now,
I witnessed as he
this perspective is, as I'm sure you can imagine, controversial because there are many who advocate parties and who argue that political parties are essential to democracy and are essential institutions precisely because we can't have democracy without parties. And one of those individuals is this famous historian, Clinton Rossiter, who said, you know, in the case of the United States, there is no America without democracy. There's no democracy without parties. And there are no parties without compromise and moderation. And this is a common argument that you cannot have democracy without parties. But it occurs to me that maybe this is an issue that some of you might have an opinion on or a point of view on. And before we begin to discuss and analyze and evaluate parties as an institution of democracy, I want us to address this and discuss this. And I want us to have a debate about democracy without parties and whether it's possible or not, and whether it's desirable or not. So, what do you all think? Can we have democracy without parties? What do you think, Efren?
Without parties, I feel like democracy would be beneficial in some way. So like in current times, right now, political parties are very very like divisive and also very like non approachable. Some may view it as like a new like or like wanting a new like government. So without political parties, I feel like constituents can have the more opportunity to raise new needs, and also like instead of just debating on like political agendas and political ideologies, it'll be more easier to like comprehend like certain aspects of like what constituents needs and all that stuff.
So maybe we improve representation and we get a better sense of what constituents need without parties. And maybe that would be because taking away the party labels would change the ways that representatives respond to constituents, perhaps. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, I liked that point that they made in the video about how because they don't have the parties, they're not really divided along like those kinds of partisan lines, and they kind of address more um, actual problems. I feel like while I don't think parties are like inherently bad or anything like that, I think that the way they've been used in America, like they've been kind of taken over by bad faith actors. Uh, so I think moving towards maybe not even completely taking parties away, but moving towards something where we're not so partisan like that. in the way that we are now would be beneficial because, uh, yeah, like they say, like in this quote, they say that you can't have democracy without parties, but I feel like democracy can't go on with how our parties are being right now as well.
Yeah, so it's like parties. You can't live with them and you can't live without them. And that's sort of, I think, one way of capturing it, right? You can easily see what function they serve, but you can also see some of the drawbacks and some of the ways that they undermine democracy. If, for example, they play as gatekeepers who try to make it difficult for new viewpoints or new ideas or new parties to gain influence. We just watched a video last week, to Jake's point, about how the big parties in American politics have sort of colluded, so to speak, to kind of rig the rules and sort of hold the system in place that benefits them and creates very high barriers to entry for small third parties. And those institutions relate to majoritarian, first past the post, plurality voting in our single member district system. And so Jake's point is very nuanced and very interesting because it suggests that maybe there's a balance that has to be struck. But I don't know if we've reached the bottom of this, because I know that there are some other viewpoints, and I'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. So let's incorporate some more ideas. What else do we think? Can we have democracy without parties? Samantha says, I think that political parties create a drift between voters when voters can't differentiate the party versus the candidates. Kayana says, yes, but we have to keep them from being hyper pluralist because democracy wouldn't work when ideas are clouding the process. Max says, I don't think it matters. I think we have a natural instinct to group with people when we relate to and share the same ideologies with. While there are no parties, that doesn't mean that the same bad habits we see in our system can't happen in a system with no parties. Very interesting point, Max. Jeffrey says, I remember learning in POLI 1 that voting for the candidates only and not the party is what makes voting more difficult in democracy since no one knows the political beliefs of that person. As the populace, we use mental shortcuts to determine who is the right candidate. Parties in that way give us the shortcuts of who has what beliefs. Take away the parties, there is no clue of who one is voting for and what beliefs they have. See, this is a very interesting point. It's sort of like, even if the parties can become a corrosive influence because they might create barriers to entry for other parties, they also serve as heuristics and they help to organize and structure politics for those of us who participate in elections. And in that regard, they become essential machinery and they help to organize politics. So what functions they serve are essential to the functioning of democracy. So maybe it's hard to do without them. Max says, so in essence, yes, we can have democracy without parties, but that doesn't solve a lot of issues. Max is saying, look, what difference does it make if our natural tendency is to group together in some way? Would we use other heuristics and would we organize ourselves some other way if we didn't have parties? Would ideology become important, for example? Karen says no, because power needs to be shared among parties. If candidates are not battling to represent us, it is not a democracy. Interesting, Karen. So Karen suggests that maybe parties help to make sure that the elections are more competitive. We know, for example, that Schumpeter defined democracy as a race between elites for the people's vote. And if it's a race between elites, perhaps parties play an important role in making sure that it's a competitive race. Now, this is an important and interesting question. Do parties help to work against powerful personalities? So for example, are you more or less likely to get a dictator or an authoritarian figure if you have no parties? Do parties help to weaken or restrict the rise of those powerful figures who might try to take advantage of the situation? Karen seems to be suggesting that that becomes possible without parties, that those individual personalities are able to sort of exploit the situation. I would actually ask you the same question. Do parties help to sort of work against those authoritarian figures who might try to rise to power in a political system? Celine says, I think that this has already been discussed, but I view parties as a way of civil society, people being able to identify themselves with a party and their ideologies. However, it seems that lately identifying with a party seems to divide the country and almost get discriminated by what party you support. So Celine points out that parties are clearly important, but we can see examples of how they become corrosive as well and how their influence can be quite negative if polarization begins to result in the cleavages that are drawn by those party differences are too large to overcome. Kimberly says, I believe that we can have democracy without parties, but parties are important for organization. And some people know more about a candidate going of their party. Not having parties will not change the mindset of people. They will still find their group. Hope says, I think it depends on the political environment of the country. I don't think America could work efficiently without parties because parties help with unity. It puts a face to policies. Okay, so there are many interesting and relevant points being made, and I thank all of you for your contributions. What you've noticed undoubtedly is that it's a complicated issue. What many of you have pointed out is that parties serve certain roles and they fulfill certain functions and they perform certain functions. They serve as heuristics and they organize politics. They connect people to the process. They structure politics. They help you to determine the association of candidates whose names you see on the ballot when you go to the polls on election day. They help to communicate information. Parties also mobilize voters. And importantly, and I'll emphasize this again, parties also help to weaken individual personalities, individuals who might otherwise attempt to concentrate power and weaken collective structures. In this sense, we can kind of think of a tension between individuals and collectives or individuals and parties. The party is a unit, it's a collective or a group, it's not an individual. And in that regard, it is going to always work against the individual interests of any individual who might try to monopolize power. And so in new democracies, especially, political parties are used as an indicator of satisfaction with the system or trust in the system. Association and attachment to parties, party identification. So they ask voters, do you feel a strong association with a party? Do you have an attachment to a party? This is used as an indicator of satisfaction with the system because of this understanding that parties can help to strengthen democracy by weakening individuals and by helping to sustain commitments to democratic institutions. And so I want you to keep this in mind as we proceed. It's complicated. We can obviously see examples of political parties undermining democracy or potentially behaving in ways that are undemocratic. But we can also think of many ways that parties serve to promote democracy or facilitate the functioning of a democratic system. And then our conclusion is that we really can't do without them and we can't really do with them. You know, it's sort of like there's no perfect situation. We're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And this is the kind of uncomfortable relationship I want us to develop with political parties as we discuss them this week in conjunction with democracy. Jeffrey adds in the chat, when it comes to democracies and parties, they complement each other. And he gives the example of parties in their role in forming the basis of the US Constitution in the Bill of Rights. They divided us into groups, he says, but they still were able to compromise and determine how government would function. Now, Jeffrey, I think that what question you would have to answer, though, is are you sure that the writing of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution was spearheaded by collective groups and not individuals? I know, Jeffrey, that you know a lot about this topic, and I know that you would have a response, but to really forcefully make your case, you would have to establish that these were programmatic objectives of the political parties that existed at the time to form the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and not ideas or projects of individuals. But that's the question that's really at stake when we're talking about the role of parties. But thank you, Jeffrey. As we discuss parties and as we define parties, we're going to work with a certain definition of parties. And a political party, as we understand it, is a group that includes people who hold or seek to hold office and people who help to keep them there. And in a democracy, you can see then political parties play an especially important role because, by definition, a democracy is a system characterized by a race between elites to win elected office. And so that competitive element is baked into the definition of democracy. So parties are part of the definition of democracy itself to the extent that groups of people support those who seek to win office. And an example of a party might be the Social Democratic Party of Romania. But we could give any number of examples of formal, official, national level political parties, but we could also distinguish between local and provincial parties and national parties. In general, parties can exist at a variety of different levels. In the United States, the Democratic and the Republican parties are clearly national parties, but there are also local and regional parties as well. And the point that I want to make to you is that parties are organizational structures that exist at a variety of different levels of analysis, and they essentially function for the same purpose in all cases, and that is to form a group for people who hold or seek to hold office and to then support those who get there and stay there. And then that means that political parties are involved in political activity and they set up offices and they set up communications, and you could be involved in a political party and the activities of a party around election day, as well as the activities of parties after election day. Parties include people who hold office as well as those who support the activities of those who hold office. So our definition of party is going to be relatively encompassing. Now, parties, as we've defined them and discussed them, have a number of functions. And these functions you've all already identified in your discussion. And so this is consistent with your conceptualization of political parties. First and foremost, party structure politics. When you go to the ballot box on election day, or when you fill out your ballot at home before mailing it in, almost inevitably, the candidates you look at on the ballot are associated with a specific party. When you read the news and read about how legislators voted, either in Congress or in the state legislature, those individual legislators are associated with a party. When you receive information about a future election, you very well may receive it from a political party with whom you are registered. You may receive it from an elections commission. But that elections commission will probably still break down the information based on different party primaries or different dates for different parties. When you participate in politics, your participation is often going to be structured by the party you align with or the party you oppose, the party that's in government or the party that seeks to remove the party that's in government. Almost every aspect of politics, be it local, national, or regional, is structured by parties. Parties organize and mediate politics so that we understand politics as being really constituted by political parties. It's difficult for us to understand politics without parties. Those labels matter a great deal. They organize information and they draw distinctions and they imply a whole bunch of prior information that individuals know to varying degrees. And so you may be a Republican or a Democrat, and you may know more or less about either party depending upon your identification. But that itself is an example of the ways that parties structure politics. But it's not just voters whose activities are structured by parties, it's also the politicians themselves. So politicians who may or may not reach out to you or send you information about election day or attempt to mobilize you, they may do so based upon your party registration, but they're doing so in the first place because they're associated with that political party. They're seeking the nomination of that political party. They're attempting to win the primary election for that political party in a given district. They're attempting to rise within the ranks of a specific political party, and so on and so forth. Parties recruit and they socialize politicians, and they have internal procedures for the election of candidates to races for election to public office. And so both the lives of voters as well as politicians are structured by parties. Now, as a voter, you're going to be mobilized more or less depending upon your association with a party. So if you're a registered Republican, you're very likely to be contacted by the Republican Party, but less likely to be contacted by the Democratic Party. If you're a Democrat, maybe you're more likely to be mobilized or contacted by someone in that party than, say, a Republican, and so on and so forth. This is all very, very understandable and intuitive because it plays with associations that we're familiar with already. And again, I want to stress to you that if this seems obvious and self-evident, it's because parties are so essential to democracy. It's hard for us to conceive of democracy without this conceptual category and this concept of a political party. And in the ultimate sense, parties link voters and officials. So once officials have been anointed after election day and voters and citizens have gone home, the relationship between citizens and officials is sustained by political parties who continue to provide information, who continue to create channels and linkages between voters and officials, and who help to constitute the relationship between parties and the constituencies they represent more generally. And so in a lot of ways, it's hard for us to imagine democracy without parties. And you could imagine that if we didn't have political parties or specific labels, that other categories may stand in that would serve us a similar function or a similar purpose. So Max, for instance, said a moment ago that maybe ideology or maybe something else would be used to differentiate one group from another, or voters would use to differentiate themselves, and so on and so forth. Jeffrey says a lot of people, I'm guilty of this too, were fooled into believing that the independent party is a party of independence. That's not the case, unfortunately. Just a heads up for anyone who voted as an independent. Yeah, so I think that interesting point, Jeffrey. Because that label independent is really conveying a proximity to existing parties, right? It's not conveying information about a party. It's conveying a contiguous position or a position relative to actual organizations. And in the United States, I think that might be frustrating for many of us who would prefer to have something truly independent or something that would be organizationally separate from the Republicans or the Democrats. Now, in a democracy, we don't just have parties, we also have the system of parties. And the system of parties is as important as the individual parties, because you might notice, for example, that the term two-party system in the US has a bad connotation. How many of you reserve hostility for that term, two-party system, because of our experience here in the US and how confining and sort of, I think, claustrophobic it feels to be in this system where we only have two choices. That label, two-party system, is only one among many labels that could be assigned to a system based on the number of parties. We might point out that just as the US has a two-party system, it could have a three or a four or a five-party system, or a one-party system, or a no-party system. And generally speaking, we do categorize countries in terms of the type of party system. And then, moreover, we distinguish between party systems based on factors that might distinguish individual party systems. So first and foremost, the effective number of parties, or the number of parties who actually have a realistic chance of winning office. And basically, mathematically, this is the number of parties weighted by the share of votes or seats that they get. So you'll notice, for instance, that the United States actually has many, many, many parties. There are lots and lots of parties. There's a Socialist Party, a Green Party, a Communist Party, on and on and on. But only the Republican Party and the Democratic Party really have a realistic shot at winning. Only those two parties really earn seats. The Socialist Party, the Green Party don't have actual representation. And so the effective number of parties in the United States is essentially two. But in a country like Ecuador or Peru, it's more along the order of four or five, because in that country there are, in most elections, dozens of parties, in Peru for that matter, but in any given legislature, there may be, six or seven parties who get seats and who have a realistic shot at getting representation. So the effective number of parties is going to be an important number that you look for to figure out what actual number of parties or how many parties are competitive or viable in this system. And then the size of parties. Again, in the United States as well, there are many, many parties, but only some of those parties are actually national parties and both effective or viable or competitive parties, and parties that are large parties. And we can distinguish then between parties based on their overall size as well as the effective number of parties in the system. And we'll do this in short order here in a moment. I'm going to check the chat. Now, there's always space for comic relief, and we're going to do that right now. and take a look at a video made by an Icelandic joke party. They're called The Best Party. And they made a video that's pretty funny. And they talk about the experience of going to the polls on election day and how you're always looking for the best party. The whole spoof is really kind of a nice satirical take on the ways that parties do organize politics and structure politics, but how they can also kind of seem sort of farcical and kind of like a caricature of themselves in some ways. And this is meant to be tongue in cheek and it's just for comic relief. But we will come back in a moment and highlight the moral of the story. But take a second and enjoy this because it is kind of fun.
Við viljum borg sem flott, sem hrein og hlý. Og hágæða stöff sem vit í. Ekki meira blöff. Borgin mín, hún þarf vera töff. Viljum gosbrunna lestir og alls konar dýr. Ekki kerjaðar hellir og stuttu brýr. Ekki meira brýr. Gefum fáanum frí. Við erum best. Bestasti flokkurinn. Besti Reykjavík. Borgin sú engur lík. Kerfið súrt. Tími til lofta út. Förum nú til. Tími fyrir gamla skil. Gefum ráðstöku fólkinu verðskulda hér. Látum okkur skepnurnar hírast í húsdýragarðinum. Við erum best. Bestasti flokkurinn. Besti Reykjavík. Borgin sú engur lík. Kerfið súrt. Tími til lofta út. Tökum nú til. Það tími fyrir þáttaskil. Þegar þú kúkast inn í kjörlefanum, með krummaða seðilinn í hnefanum. Mátt ekki veia á vitlausan hest. Veldu okkur, það best. Kæru samborgarar, nú þarf hver Reykvíkingur að líta sér nær, skoða hjarta sitt, spurja sig, fjölskyldu sína og jafnvel trúnaðarvini. Vil ég bjarta framtíð með verstaflokknum eða vil ég partíma Reykjavík best? Ókeypis handklæði í öllum sundstöðum. Bestasti flokkurinn. Ísjöfn í húsdýragarðinn. Besti Reykjavík. Alls konar fyrir aumingjar. Hver þessi líf? Disneyland í Vatnsmýri. Kerfið súrt. Híkni efnalaust Alþingi 2020. Komið verða loftir mús. Sjálfbært gegnsæi. Stefnum nú til. Útverðna verðu inn með einarmenn. Stoppum þessi fólksbíl. Okkar hug á seljanan
mean, it seems like a message you can get behind, right? It's the best party. So it's obviously it's a caricature, but it's funny. This is what parties do, right? They paint the other party as delirious, all the best for the unfortunates, all kinds of animals for the zoo, etc. And in this way, parties seem to be examples of all the best and worst things about politics because they do mobilize voters and they do create meaning in structure politics, but they also seem to to create these absolutely almost humorous, comical messages about the opposition and what's advantageous about their policy program. And in the end, voters and citizens might not learn much about the parties at all. They may be given choices that don't really represent what might actually take place in office. And so this is a funny video because it just plays with that a little bit. And Jake actually says, I see no difference between this and how our parties campaign now. I agree. And, you know, he said a drug-free parliament by 2020. I'm interested in knowing whether Iceland has accomplished that. But really, the issue of counting parties is an important one because lots of parties exist everywhere, and these joke parties don't get counted. We don't count every party that exists. And there's clearly a difference between joke parties and parties that do intend to win political power and win office and change policy. And it is true that there can be nothing scarier in some cases than a political party that is intent on seizing office and ruling. And so militaries, political parties, both can carry out political coups. And so parties are something to take seriously, and parties can be quite formative. But nevertheless, it's funny to notice that the Mongolian barbecue, great place to party, is a party, as is the monster raving loony party, the Church of the Militant Elvis party, the Guns and Dope party, the sun ripened warm tomato party in Australia, and the beer drinkers party, which exists in Russia and virtually everywhere else. But in that case, and in other cases, is not a real party. We wouldn't count these as real parties, but we certainly would count as real parties those parties that run candidates in national elections, in that have a large size, in that win seats in Congress. So when we talk about parties and party systems in democracy, one of the most important questions is why democracies differ in terms of the type of party system. We can distinguish between democracies based on whether it's a presidential or a parliamentary democracy. We might also distinguish between them based on the type of electoral system, which we've also done, majoritarian versus proportional. But a third way to distinguish them is in terms of the party system, and whether it's a two-party system, a no-party system, multi-party system, or so on. And when we begin to distinguish between them based on that third distinction and that third category of distinction, we arrive at an important set of questions about why some countries are divided along ethnic party lines and why others are divided along class party lines or religious or linguistic or regional lines. In other words, why do some systems have many parties and others few? And why do some systems have class-based political parties and others ethnic political parties? Why do some have linguistic or religious or regional political parties while others have national political parties? And this is a question or a set of questions that gets us into the sources and causes of different identities and why societies differ from each other in terms of group and group identity. These are much, much more fundamental questions. And the types of political parties that become possible will depend a lot on the precise cleavages in the precise divisions or differences between the social groups in those societies. So some societies, some countries have ethnic parties because they have ethnic cleavages. Some parties have class parties because they have class cleavages. Other societies have linguistic parties or religious parties because they have linguistic or religious cleavages. Other societies have confessional or sectarian cleavages because they have cleavages that exist inside religious groups, and so on and so forth. And any democracy can be understood in terms of those cleavages and precisely which cleavages exist and how they divide the society up into different groups. And so we can think about, for example, an urban rural cleavage. I know that this is a cleavage that is relatively familiar for us in California, where in Central California, it's more rural, and where the coastal part of the state is often more urban. That urban rural cleavage, that division, does often correspond with a division in political identification. Now, of course, it's not perfect, and there are many, many exceptions on an individual level, but that cleavage, that division, does exist. And societies can break down into urban rural splits that do roughly correspond often with divisions in political party. So in the United States, the urban party is the Democratic Party, the rural party is the Republican Party, and it's often been that way. There are confessional divisions or cleavages, divisions that exist between different groups within sects or religious groups. And so, for instance, in in Germany, you can distinguish between Christian Democrats and non-Christian Democrats, and others who might essentially all be Christians, but who might think of themselves in terms of different confessional groups or different confessional um, identities. Those confessional cleavages can be important too. Oftentimes, religious parties in the Middle East can break down along confessional lines as well. There can be breakdowns along secular clerical lines, and so divisions between non religious parties and religious parties. They correspond with divisions between social groups that are secular and social groups that are clerical. There can be class cleavages between workers and capitalists. This is very common. Workers tend to be more leftist and tend to conceive of themselves as a class. Capitalists tend to be more right leaning or conservative and tend to conceive of themselves as a class. These class based cleavages are also very commonly associated with divisions in political parties. There are ethnic and linguistic cleavages that are very, very important as well. And all of these are examples of cleavages that exist in a society to varying degrees and can help us to understand why political parties might break down along certain lines in that society. Now, every society is different, right? And so the relative importance of one cleavage or another can be a big part of the story about why some parties are more important than others, or why some parties are national parties and why others are not. And the question that comes up for us and that we'll address on Wednesday and Friday is, why do these cleavages exist? And for example, why is there one party for workers and one for capitalists? Why don't different groups belong to the same party? And we're going to begin to consider the role of identity formation. And subsequent lessons this week will incorporate identity and begin to talk about identity in democracy and how political parties as institutions relate closely to identity. So thank you everybody for being here and helping us get started. We'll continue on Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you then. Take it easy, Intel. Thank you, Manuel. Thanks, Michael.
Bye, Professor.
Have a good one, Max.